So I want to welcome you to this postmortem on the election. This event is sponsored by the Roper Center and Cornell University and DCA Port. And the additional sponsors are Recon MR and Marketing Systems Group. I'm Murray Edelman, a member of the Roper Board. I'm an election consultant and a past president of the American Association of Public Opinion Research. I'll be the moderator of this panel. Our panel consists of Amy Walter of the Cook Report, Mark Hugo Lopez of Pew Center, and Vince Hutchings of the University of Michigan. They will each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. And I'll introduce them more fully each time before they speak. So a little housekeeping things. At the bottom of your screen is a Q&A over to the right. That's the way that you can directly get to us. And that's for your questions, or if you want to get my attention or a comment or something that I might want to say. There's also a chat function, and that's a place where you can talk to everybody or specific individuals. You can use that. And that's basically how we're going to move through the next hour and maybe an hour and a half. Our panel was set up to talk about what we've learned from this election. But I want to start by addressing perhaps the elephant in the room. That is the errors in pre-election polls. So we can at least address the methodology and then go on to the original intention for this panel to discuss what we've learned. So just a few brief points. The problem with the pre-election polls seemed much bigger election night than it is now. The mail ballots in states like California are still being counted, and the Democratic margin is increasingly widening. So the overall average error national basis, average by state, but of course some had much bigger errors than others. Now this is still a very serious issue, and APOR, Pew, and other organizations will be studying the issue for sure, and there'll be stuff written about it, and I'm sure changes will be made. But it'll take time for this to happen. Some people will be conducting post-election polls to evaluate what happened. And also the polling will be compared to voter databases. And we have to wait for these databases to be updated before we can see what we missed. There is an excellent article from Pew, Scott Keeter, Courtney Kennedy, and Claudia Dean, that just came out today on this specific issue. I highly recommend it, and I'll put that in the chat. The challenges that have come up appear to be much more toward the specifics of pre-election polling than to polling in general. And another point is that the voter polls, which we'll be referring to, are weighted to the outcome of the election. So while this is perhaps a fairly limited issue, but certainly very important. The Roper Center is talking now about hosting a meeting probably next month by Zoom to talk about these methodological issues in more detail. So you might look for it. It's still just in the planning stages, however. So now on to the panel. The first speaker is Mark Hugo Lopez. He is Director of Hispanic Research at Pew Research. Studies the two opinions of Latinos, Hispanic view of identity, the political and Cubans election, Latino Youth. Lopez also coordinates Center's National Survey of Latinos, an annual and widespread Hispanics.
Thank you, Murray. Thank you. It's been an interesting year. In fact, I think to put everything in context, it's important to note that 2020 has been a year of a lot of events in it, including the election, one of many events. But the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on the way Americans are living their lives and engaging with each other, and that's having an impact on also the election. As you noted, many people voted early, for example, by mail. In many states changed the way in which they conducted their elections. On top of that, COVID-19 also is associated with the economic downturn that resulted from the closing of many businesses in order to protect the public as the COVID-19 virus was spreading around the country. But also, I think it's interesting to note that this was a year where there's been a very, very deep conversation about race and racial inequality in the United States in the months following George Floyd's killing in Minnesota. So when you think about this year, there have been so many events which, of course, have had an impact on the ways in which the public was thinking about not only their own lives and what's happening in their lives, but also how they might have engaged with both candidates and also the election. I want to talk a little bit about the Latino vote, because one of the things in the postmortems that have happened after this election have been questions about how Hispanic voters voted in this past election. And I want to say Hispanic voters as opposed to the Hispanic vote or the Latino vote, to capture the idea that this is a group of people who are diverse and have different points of view. And that's really, I think, one of the things that's come out of this particular election, as analysts have talked about about Latino voters over the course of the 2020 election cycle. A characterization of Latino voters as diverse, as different, and as varied as you look across the country. But how did Latino voters break in terms of this election for Joe Biden and for Donald Trump? Well, according to the exit polls, and I want to stress that the exit polls could still be updated because we haven't finished seeing the counting of votes across the country, and that reweighting could result in some additional changes to these results. But Latino voters supported Joe Biden 2-1 over Donald Trump. The national election poll exit poll from Edison Research shows, for example, that Latinos supported Biden at 65% compared to 32% for Trump. Part of the conversation this year about Latino voters has been about the support for Latino voters that seemed strong in places like, for example, Miami-Dade in South Florida, where there are many Cuban, Nicaraguan, Dominican, Venezuelan, and Colombian voters who seem to have supported Donald Trump perhaps even more so than in 2016. And also what's happened along the US-Mexico border, where it looks like vote tallies from many of the counties which have Hispanic populations that make up about 95% or more of the population in those places, also seem to have supported Donald Trump more this year than in 2016. But on the other side, you see a lot of support for Biden that perhaps matches, if not even exceeds, that for Hillary Clinton in many other parts of the country, including in a state like California. So when you look at the Hispanic voters this year, the story of diversity, the story of different stories, and the story of a group of voters who perhaps can't be easily characterized in a single way is, I think, one of the big points that comes to mind for me when I think about this particular election cycle. I'd also want to put this in context to the past, and that's really, I think, one of the other interesting points about Latino voters, is that while Trump may have won about a third of the Latino vote, according to Edison Research's exit poll, when you take a look at the history of Latino support for Republican and Democratic presidential candidates over the years, you do see that Latino support for Republican candidates has varied from anything as low as about 26%, say for Mitt Romney in 2012, to something as high as 40 to 44% for George Bush in 2004. Notably, in the 1980s, Latino voters then supported Ronald Reagan with about 30 to 35% of the Latino voters' support in those years. So when you take a look at this year, in many ways, the level of support among Latino voters for Trump doesn't look much different from what we've seen in the past, and it does reflect within the Latino voter population, many different groups of voters, evangelical voters, third-generation Hispanics, Cuban Americans, for example, all of whom have tended to be perhaps sometimes stronger in their support for Republican presidential candidates over the years. I do think we need to wait to get more information, Murray, as you were saying. We need to do verified voter analyses, and the Pew Research Center will be doing that for all voters coming up later on in 2021. But that will give us a good sense of where Latino voters went, and also many other voters went in this election cycle, given all the questions that people have about the quality of the polls this year. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. Thank you. So just to remind you all that if you hit the Q&A, you can ask questions, and we'll be accumulating them, and I'll be asking your questions shortly after the panelists are done. Our next speaker, and there's no questions yet, so you can get right in there. Our next speaker is Amy Walter. Amy is a national editor of the Cook Political Report. She provides analysis of the issues, trends, and events that shape the political environment. She hosts Politics with Amy Walter on the Takeaway radio news program and contributes to PBS NewsHour through a perspective weekly on Politics Monday. And we're really happy to have Amy here. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray. And also, Mark Hugo, thank you, who's been one of my guests, and a great guest, and helping us to, and my listeners, to understand all the complexities of Latino Vote. So I appreciate that. And his insights are really remarkable. And I also have to credit Pew, who not only in the work that Mark Hugo Lopez does, but the entire crew there, and the verified analysis that they did after the 2016 election has really been my Bible for this election in understanding who voted and really appreciating how challenging it is to make this work and how much work goes into doing that. So for me, I am anxiously awaiting. I know it's going to take some time for voter files to be updated, but that's where I'm going to go and look to see where actually voters ended up, specific demographic groups ended up in this election. What we do know, though, and I'm just going to take sort of the 30,000 foot view, it wasn't simply that we came into this election with pre-election expectations based on the presidential polls, but polls that really usually don't get a lot of attention. And quite frankly, there aren't many public polls that cover the House, is where things also went somewhat awry. And this was true in private polling as well as public polling at the House level. And so I'm also very curious to see the analysis going into what happened there. This wasn't just a public thing. This wasn't just a Democratic thing. This was across the board, Democratic, Republican, private polling. So the challenge seems as public. If we look at where we've been and where we ended up, I mean, to me, what's the most remarkable about this moment in time that we're living through, this year of 2020, is how we had so much tumult and chaos. At the same time, we had such incredible political stability. The president's overall job approval rating didn't budge all that much between January of 2020 and the end of the election. There were some blips up and there were some blips down, but it stayed pretty consistent. He ended the year pretty much where he started it, somewhere in the mid 40s. Gallup pegged it at 46% in their final polling. As we know, one of the best predictors of the final presidential vote is the job approval rating. If you go back and look at where previous presidents, going all the way back to Jimmy Carter, where their final vote ended up on election day was somewhere within 1 point of the job approval rating. Recently, it's been between 1 and 2 points, and it looks like that's exactly where Donald Trump is going to end up. As I said, he was at 46% coming into this election, probably ends up somewhere around 47%, little 47% of the vote. I think the popular vote right now, he's at 47.4%. With still a lot of ballots to be counted. So incredible consistency in opinions of this president despite all the tumult. And the final results, so incredible status quo and stability. Republicans picking up seats in the House, but the seats that they picked up were ones that Trump carried in 2016 by a pretty decent margin. These weren't districts that were surprises in the sense that, you know, these were the kinds of districts we had been, I think, in the political universe would argue were some of the most tenuous for Democrats after they won them in 2018. And on the Senate side, Democrats hoping to get the majority. They still have an opportunity with 2 runoffs in January in Georgia, but their ability to win a majority really depended on Joe Biden winning in traditionally reddish purple or reddish states like Iowa or South Carolina or North Carolina or Kansas, right? There are all these states on the map, but they were in traditional Republican territory. And so we end up with an election that I think at its core was a referendum on Donald Trump. And that is why I think Joe Biden won the presidential election. But it wasn't a referendum party, which is why I think Republicans down ballot were still able to be successful. In fact, it's kind of remarkable. I think that Donald Trump may be the first losing presidential candidate to have coattails. And the winning presidential candidate really didn't have many at all. The one place especially where I think that stands out is the state of Maine, where Susan Collins running an uphill battle in that this is a state that Joe Biden we knew was going to win. He won it handily. And yet Collins Trump by about 8 points. She had the most distinction between her vote and the top of the ticket of any one of the candidates. But that is one of those where the expectation was, okay, if Joe Biden's going to help anywhere and help any down ballot candidate, it could be in Maine. That didn't come to pass. It also is remarkable to me how much this election, again, with so much that's happened, it's been so dramatic. The actual numbers that we're seeing are pretty undramatic. Maybe that's right. I don't know what the exact right word is, but this was a race that Joe Biden won on margins, winning overall. My colleague, I want to give a shout out to him, who is spending hours and hours every day updating our popular vote tracker by hand at the Cook Political Report. And what he's finding right now is we know that that Biden's had something about 5 million votes total. It looks like he will have improved on Hillary Clinton's national vote margin by about 2 points, maybe 3 points when all is said and done. In those 15 battleground states, Biden improved on Hillary Clinton's margin by 2 points. If you look at the Electoral College for Biden, Michigan, again, this is a just 3 point difference between Clinton and Biden, just improving on her performance by 3 points, just a little over 1.5 points in Pennsylvania, about the same in Wisconsin. Arizona and Georgia, obviously Biden overperformed Clinton by a bigger margin, 4 points in Arizona, 5 points in Georgia. But, you know, you look at where I just picked 3 counties in Pennsylvania and looked at the difference between 2016 and 2018, and you see how Biden sort of put this coalition together was by running up the score in the Philadelphia suburbs. We kind of always knew that was going to happen. In a county, Chester County, right outside the city, Clinton carried it by 9. These are not the final numbers, but it looks like Biden carried it by about 16, so almost doubling Clinton's margin. But then in the Trump-friendly areas, like Luzerne County, which is Wilkes-Barre, Trump carried that by 20 points in 2016. It looks like he only carried it by 14 this time. So Biden, again, just shaving off a little bit of those margins. Same in Erie County in the northwest part of the state. Trump carried it by a little over 2 points, Biden carrying it by 1 point. That is kind of the same formula you saw in Michigan and Wisconsin as well. And fundamentally, I think, you know, this goes to the question of, you know, how long for Donald Trump. He was making a bet at how much the base could provide his margin of victory, that you can win. He thought just by driving up his vote. He was very successful at doing that. He was very successful at keeping his base intact. But at the end of the day, you still need to get to 50%. He didn't get to 50% in 2016, not just in the popular vote, but in those states I mentioned, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona. He only took 47 or 48% there. He lost all 4 of these this time. So if you've never gotten to 50% and you're running just on turning out the people who voted for you last time or people who look like the people who voted for you last time, that is a dangerous gamble to not try to at least expand beyond that, especially as Joe Biden showed he can.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Thank you. And our next speaker is Vince Hutchings. He's the Haynes Walton Jr. Collegiate Professor of Political Science and Afro-American and African Studies, as well as the University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor at the University of Michigan. His research includes an examination of the ways in which political campaigns and the media frame information about racial issues in order to activate and make politically relevant the voters' sympathies and or antipathies for particular racial groups. Vince, it's yours.
Thanks, Murray. Hopefully everyone can hear me here. I'll just speak for a few minutes as well. And I think it's worth noting that the panelists did not coordinate a message here, but what I'm going to say is going to be very similar to what you've already heard. So I hope that triangulation means that we're on the right track here. I think that if there's really just two big points I want to make, and I'll flesh those out in a moment. One is addressing some of the social media chatter about the Black vote in particular. I'll talk about that, maybe especially Black males, and how they voted as a group this election cycle, at least based on the exit polls. And then about the striking continuity of the outcome was really the most impressive feature to me of the 2020 elections. So there's certainly conversations to be had about the pre-election polls, and there's questions to be had about various other things. But more than anything else, when I look at least the preliminary exit poll data, I'm struck with how little things have changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me just start by saying that so there was a lot of chatter, in part emanating from the Trump campaign and supporters, and in part just from some media organizations, about how the racial gap was closing, or the apparent gap in presidential preference in 2020 looked different somehow than previous years. But it's not all predicated. And again, these data, as indicated, are preliminary, the national election pool data, but it suggests that 87%, I believe, based on my notes here, yes, 87% of African Americans voted for Biden, 12% voted for Trump, and among whites, which is the implicit group that we're often talking about but don't often give voice to, but I'll be more explicit. Among whites, according to those same exit polls, 57% voted for Trump in, again, based on the preliminary exit polls in 2020, and 42% voted for Biden. That looks pretty similar to what we saw in 2016. So again, for the moment, just for simplicity's sake, in part because Mark's already discussed the Hispanic votes, plural, I'm just going to talk about the Black-white divide. In 2016, according to the national exit polls, Trump got 57% of the white vote and Clinton got 37%. So Biden did better, certainly, if you are to believe those numbers at least, but not dramatically better. And he did about as well, frankly, as we would expect any generic Democrat to do with respect to this constituency. So Democrats, as I suspect many of you already know, Democratic presidential candidates dating back to the early 70s, late 60s, have usually flirted with the low to mid 40 percentile range in terms of support among white voters. And in terms of support among Black voters, the Democrats have usually hovered in the low to mid 80s or into the low to mid 90s, depending on who the candidate is. So that's been the range for about the last 50 years with respect to how those two populations have done with Democrats. In terms of how they've done with Republicans, it's usually obviously the converse. Republicans typically get sometimes in the mid to low 50s. Reagan was able to get in the high 60s or the low 60s. But that's about what we would expect. I went back and in preparation for this event, I went back and looked at some of the exit poll data going back to 1976. So for Gerald Ford, I think he got 17%. He got a whopping 17% of the black vote. That was enormous. And that would be the last time any Republican would get north of 15% among African Americans. So Reagan got 14. I think Bob Dole got 12. George W. Bush got 11. And Donald Trump, again, at least according to the preliminary exit polls. And for the moment, I'm leaving aside the AP Votecast preliminary results, which suggest that Trump did even worse than the numbers I'm mentioning. But we'll put that to the side for the moment. So Donald Trump got 12% of the black vote, which is about what a generic Republican would be expected to get in any election cycle among blacks over the last 50 plus years. So what's the takeaway message here? The takeaway message is I don't see anything that looks different than what I would have expected. And now that gets to the second part of my comments, of course. Many people are probably thinking, how? Indeed, I think I may have seen one of these questions in the chat. How does a candidate like Donald Trump manage to get anything above 0% among blacks or Latinos? And, we may have a chance to flesh this out moving forward, but I'll just say, obviously Trump is unconventional in a number of dimensions, but he's only unconventional as a Republican presidential candidate and president to the extent that people are really paying that much attention. And of course, if there's any truism in my time studying American politics, is that most people actually aren't paying that much attention. So for the standard voter, I suspect most of the audience already knows this, but it bears repeating. For the standard voter in 2020 and in any other year, Donald Trump is just like any other Republican. And so he generated comparable levels of support and opposition. So much of that's already been said. I just mostly wanted to emphasize that. I agree completely with what my fellow panelists have said. But I want to end at least my preliminary comments here on the following note. Again, the thing that jumped off the page to me, because I was expecting at least a little bit more movement among a number of groups, maybe most especially. The pre-election polling data suggested that Biden was going to be doing better than a generic Democrat would do with that admittedly broad population of voters. And in the end, he basically did. Okay, so maybe that's just another indication that at the end of the day, this was an election. In 2020, with all that's different about it, it wasn't all that different in terms of the outcome of the vote among relevant social groups, salient social groups in our society. But I think it's worth drawing our attention to the fact that we don't find much change there. So this is a year, 2020, if anyone on in the webinar needs to be reminded, where we've had the worst public health crisis in 100 years and the worst, precipitous decline in our economy since the Great Depression. We've had racial unrest of the sort we haven't seen since the late 1960s. Indeed, by some indications, we had the largest protest movement numerically in the country this past summer than we have ever had. All of these things coupled with I think it's fair to say that Trump, at least on some dimensions, was a non-traditional candidate based on a variety of things I could say, but I don't think I need to for this audience. So all those things, and yet 55 to 57%, depending on which exit polls you want to listen to, of white Americans still vote for the Republican candidate. He still won handily in Ohio. He still won Florida. And so maybe the question shouldn't be, wow, why did so many Latinos and blacks vote for Donald Trump? Maybe the question should be, in spite of everything I just said, why did a majority of whites vote for him? And I think the answer might simply be that we underestimate the power of partisanship. I'm not trying to be coy here. I'm not trying to say anything about the base motives of those who vote for Donald Trump. They're perfectly fine reasons to vote for Trump or Biden. But what I am getting at is the power of partisanship. At the end of the day, however unconventional Donald Trump may be, he is a Republican. He had a big R by his name, and that was sufficient for most voters. So The big takeaway from me is the power of partisanship and its ability to block out a pandemic that's the worst we've seen in 100 years, to block out an economic collapse like we haven't seen since the Great Depression, and to block out racial unrest like we haven't seen in this country in a generation or two. That is the big takeaway from where I'm sitting. Thanks.
Thanks, Vince. That's a really good point, and I'd like to open this up for other people to comment on that, because as you were speaking, Mark, I got 2 or 3 questions about how could Hispanics vote for someone who's done said such awful things about them, and in various ways like that. I've had that in various variations on that question. So.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I get often over the years. In fact, even predating Donald Trump's candidacy, you do get questions about how some in the Latino population, for example, could support a policy such as deporting those who are in the country without authorization or who are undocumented immigrants. But again, I think it's important to note that the Hispanic population is diverse in many ways, and all Latinos do not share the same point of view on every policy and every political candidate. So in the case of immigration, going back to immigration, you might find, for example, that perhaps Mexican Americans were more in tune or attuned to Donald Trump's comments about Mexican immigrants being criminals and rapists and so forth. But when you talk to those who might be, say, Cuban or Dominican or Colombian, you might hear a conversation that goes something like this instead. That's really terrible what Donald Trump has said, but I'm not Mexican. That really does get at, again, some of the differences within the population, which may be correlated with which candidates they support. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, Hispanic voters back in 2004 supported George Bush at a level of about 40 to 44%, according to exit polls. But when you take a look at the reasons why, or you might ask yourself, why might Latinos support a Republican candidate like George Bush back then? Well, he had been governor of Texas, and he also had engaged in many policy, had made many policy proposals and pushed forward many policies that had a lot of support among Latinos in Texas. For example, bilingual education, or relations with Mexico, or trade with Mexico. So, given the candidates, you could find that sometimes some Hispanics will support those candidates, whether they're Republican or Democrat. In the case of Donald Trump, you do see support for Donald Trump higher among evangelical Hispanics, for example, than among Hispanics who have no party affiliation. Why might that be? Part of it is the support that particularly Donald Trump had for keeping abortion or making abortion illegal in all or most cases. And I think that that's an important point to note, because this is one of those places where Latinos are different than the public. They haven't moved much in their views on abortion, unlike the U.S. public generally, which has moved more towards being supportive of abortion policy that makes abortion, at least in some cases, legal, depending on circumstances. So when you take a look at the Hispanic population, it's diverse in many ways, and some Latinos like what Donald Trump had to say about groups like immigrants who are in the country without authorization. So that diversity, I think, is an important point to note. Mary, there was one other question I wanted to touch base on from Molly Ann Brody that was about the Black Lives Matter movement. And that, I think, is also an important point to note, that our surveys of Pew Research showed that among Hispanics, among whites, and among Asians, the share who strongly or somewhat supported the Black Lives Matter movement declined between June and September of this year. Among Latinos, that support dropped from about 3/4 to 2/3 of Latino adults saying that they strongly or somewhat supported the Black Lives Matter movement. And when you take a look at Cuban Americans, particularly, you'll find that the issue of public safety and violent crime actually rated higher as an issue for them, behind the economy, COVID-19, et cetera, but higher for them than it did among other groups of Hispanic voters in the United States. So again, there are some distinctions here and some stories to be told that again point to the diversity of the Latino vote.
You have while you're on this, Mark, I also got a question about the right-wing radio outreach. Do you have any evidence about that, if that was effective?
That's something that we haven't looked at the Pew Research Center, and I'm not sure if I have seen any hard evidence or data to point to what impact that might have had. But it's a good question.
Good. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Amy, do you want to comment on this? It's a big question.
I mean, I love how Vince framed this because we have spent, I mean, it's only been a week. It feels like it's been about 37 years since the election officially ended.
Amen.
This entire year has felt like 100 years. But I love that he ended it, like, we are spending so much time dancing on the head of a pin about Latino voters at the border, African-American voters in Milwaukee, when we're not getting at the heart of it, which is, at the end of the day, again, this, assuming that this is, I'm looking at the AP VoteCast data, but in a state like Georgia, you still only have 30%, they said 29% of white voters supporting Joe Biden. Joe Biden his win in a state like Georgia came because of voters of color. The end of story. So the real story is not so much, well, gosh, they lost Texas. I guess Biden lost Texas because these Latinos down at the border didn't vote for him. No. I think in that state, I don't have it in front of me, but it was typically low percent, probably 40 or less than 40%, maybe 35% of white votes for Joe Biden in Texas. And those states really do stand out when we think about where Democrats go from here, where Republicans go from here, looking especially North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, Florida. The white vote is significant, 60% or more for Republicans. And no matter how well or not that Democrats are able to do among Latinos or other voters of color, it's hard to win when you're losing, 60, 70% of white voters in these states. So I do think we should be spending as much time talking about, to Vince's point, how is it, if we're gonna scrutinize voters of color for supporting or even thinking about supporting a man who says racist things, shouldn't we also ask white voters, you said you wanted X, Y, and Z to happen. It didn't happen. Why did you still support Donald Trump? You know people around you who have died of, why did you not put that as your top priority? I think it would be a fascinating look into that. And I think that Vince is right, that it really comes down to partisanship being a much more salient. And in fact, this entire election, I think, was much less about issues than it was about identity and an existential question about identity, that it was not so much who do you think is going to do a better job in fixing X, Y, and Z problem. This is especially true among white voters, I think, especially among white voters, not so much about the policy or the issues, but what it says about who America is and what America is. And if you didn't like what you thought America looked like with Donald Trump in charge, you voted against him. If you wanted to see an America that Donald Trump promoted, then you voted for him. And that, sorry to say the word trumped, but it's a perfect term in this case. I think that just trumped everything else.
Oh, okay. Now, just a little shift. I had a question about the exit poll, and someone wanted to know how do you account for mail ballots when you do an exit poll? And so just let you know that the exit poll has 3 different components to it. One is, of course, the in-person voting on election day. When there's early voting, like in states like Texas, they do in-person voting in these locations. And the third component is phone polls that are done the few days before the election. So it is everybody. It isn't just the people that vote election day. So moving on. Well, this is, you've kind of touched on this already, but what role did the pandemic play in moving Republicans to Biden? And what did anything to say about the Lincoln Project, or did any sense of that having any kind of impact?
I'll just talk very quickly because I don't know specifically about the Lincoln Project and what impact its campaign had. there's not a lot of evidence in the literature that I'm familiar with that suggests that these sorts of campaigns can be pivotal. I mean, obviously it can make a difference at the margins, and I suppose at the margins are when where elections are won or lost. But I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record, I suspect, but I'll run that risk nonetheless. I think many people would like to believe that the particulars of the campaign, how the candidates perform in the debate, various things they do on the campaign trail, are shifting a huge number of voters. But my understanding is that that's the evidence that I'm familiar with, at least, suggests that that's unlikely to be true. And so there's a reason why I wanted to draw our attention to partisanship, because of course that doesn't change so much, and that's not a feature of the campaign per se, but that is what's driving most of the vote. And I just want to reiterate a point I made earlier. Obviously, this event is appropriately about a postmortem on 2020, and I'm obviously happy to speak to that, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there's something troubling about our society where we have such lopsided support for one party among populations defined as non-white, and such lopsided support for another party among populations defined as white. That is troubling, and it's not a consequence of Donald Trump. It was here before Trump, and it'll be here after Trump is gone. And so it's easy to overlook that and to talk around that and to pretend like that's not a problem or a feature of our political system, but it is a deeply unhealthy aspect of our society, and I just want to draw our attention to it.
Okay, well, actually related to that was just a question of, would you say that the vast majority of Trump voters can be seen as at risk of losing traditional privilege? That's a big motivating factor?
Well, there's a political scientist that many of you may be familiar with, Liliana Mason, who has argued that, so I'm stealing from her, but I am giving her credit. So that one of the things that makes for our seemingly toxic political environment now is the ways in which different social groups have moved at perhaps a glacial pace over the last few decades towards particular parties in a fashion consistent with what I and Amy and others have been saying. So that, in speaking to your question, Murray, the one that you just summarized, so when a political party wins or loses, it isn't just the victory for a political party or even an ideological perspective. It's a victory or a loss for a racial group and for an ethnic group or for a religious community. And obviously, you take the partisan divide in this country and you layer it on top of the history this country has had with questions of race and class and gender and religion, and that makes for a pretty combustible mix. So that's partly what's going on. It used to be that, these weren't exactly the good old days, but it was nevertheless the case that in a few decades in the past, you could find ideological and even racial conservatives in both parties, and similarly with respect to ideological and racial liberals. And it doesn't have to be on the basis of race. We could be talking about class or religion. And there was a diversity of a sort, certainly at the elite level and probably at the mass level. But that's increasingly become less true over time. And that's probably part of the reason why every election seems like it's some kind of existential threat, as opposed to just the consequence of one election.
Okay, thank you. So any comments about the brewing internal dispute around messaging on socialism and defund the police? Is there anything that you all see in what's happened to add to that question, that sort of center versus left kind of controversy?
Well, I feel like I'm just echoing all the smart things that Vince says, but Liliana Mason is fascinating. I interviewed her recently and got a lot out of that. So I'm going to put a plug in for her as well. Look, I think as I said, this was an election that was a referendum on Donald Trump, and that was the campaign that Joe Biden ran, which it was not a very aspirational campaign. It was not a particularly inspirational campaign. It really was vote for me because I'm not going to be Donald Trump. And that was enough to win, and that's fine. But that is also not really a message about who the Democratic Party is and what the Democratic Party is. And in fact, I would argue he spent as much time describing who he wasn't. I'm not Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I'm not, but also I'm not Bernie Sanders, right? So I'm just this guy kind of in the middle between these two, right? So don't put me over here. I'm not about banning fracking, and I'm not about socialism, and I don't want to defund the police, but I'm also not this hothead person who sits in the White House shooting off tweets. Again, I think that worked. So that's fine, but it did not define who the Democratic Party was. And I think that was incredibly challenging, especially for down ballot Democrats who found themselves having to answer a question about who the Democratic Party is. Now, normally it's the party nominee who answers that question, right? And I think they saw Joe Biden and thought, whoo, right? When he won, so many of those moderate members in those swing suburban districts who won in 2018 were terrified about the prospect of Bernie Sanders winning the nomination. So when Biden won, it was like, okay, good, we're done. Nobody's going to think that we're socialists because we got good old Joe, middle of the road, centrist dude. We're fine. But in that vacuum that was created in part by COVID, right? Because there wasn't traditional campaigning, and a campaign of which was really very anemic on who we are and what we stand for. I'm sure they will yell at me and show me all the different platforms they put out and all the ads they put out, and that's fine. But I just think it was not quite robust. But it is a nice way of saying that. It left the Democrats really kind of struggling to figure out who they were. And so I do think it was an effective tool that Republicans used against down ballot candidates, again, in Republican leaning areas. It didn't work. I'm here in Northern Virginia. That's not going to work in the Northern Virginia suburbs. It didn't work in the Atlanta suburbs. It didn't work in the Chicago suburbs, or some parts of the Chicago suburbs, I'd argue. But it can work in the Cincinnati suburbs. It can work in some parts of Texas. It can work in the Indianapolis and St. Louis suburbs. So that to me is sort of where that went from there. And look, now Democrats are the party in charge because they have the White House, and it is up to Biden now. He said it I don't know if you all remember that point at the debate when Trump said, you're just a pawn or whatever he said for the Socialist Party. Bernie Sanders is going to own you, is going to own you. He said, no, I'm the Democratic Party. So now he has to go out and define who the Democratic Party is. And right now it has been, and I think it will be for these next couple of months as he starts, it will still be about, I'm the COVID fighting guy, which again is what physically doing. It's not necessarily a message of who the party is.
Thanks. Just a comment to people with questions. There's like 180 participants and lots of questions. So if you can make them shorter, you have a better chance. It's hard to get through them. I have a question. We haven't talked much about generation, and I'd like us to talk about some. One of the questions was about Paul Goodwin is a California pollster, and his pre-election polling was pointing to a lot of different between younger U.S.-born Latinx voters and older non-U.S.-born voters, and just generally the issues about age in our different communities. Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's a really great question. In the work that we've done on Latino Voters over the years, one of the things that we do see is a difference in views by what I call immigrant generation. So among Latino voters, you'll find that those who are immigrants or the US born children of immigrant parents tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party, for example, in terms of party ID, or tend to have more what one might characterize as progressive views on issues such as the minimum wage or on how big of a government people might have a preference for. But when you take a look at third and higher generation Latinos, these are people who are US born and whose parents were also born in the US, you do see some differences in viewpoints that tend to be more, for example, they tend to be more likely to lean towards the Republican Party than the Democratic Party, although still a majority lean towards the Democratic Party, I should say, but in comparison to other generation Hispanics. And also they tend to sometimes have more conservative views on some policy issues than other groups of Latinos who are either immigrants themselves or the US born children of immigrant parents. But I think it just speaks to some of the changes that are happening within the Latino population. One of the big trend changes over the last 20 years has been the decline in the number of new immigrant arrivals in the last 10 years compared to, say, the 1990s. And that's led to a change in the composition of the population. And if we're talking just about voters, those who are third and higher generation tend to be a larger part of the Hispanic electorate than you see, say, among the general adult population, because many immigrant Hispanics who are adults may not hold US citizenship. But the future of the Latino population in the United States is driven by those who are born here. So that that second and that third generation are going to only make up larger shares of the nation's Latino population and therefore Latino voters. So some of these differences that you're observing with younger Latinos being perhaps more likely to be second and third generation, they are eventually going to be the voters that will make up the bulk of the Latino voters in the future. And they do tend to have somewhat different points of view to begin with than their immigrant counterparts, for example.
Thanks. Vince, could you talk about among Black voters? Afro-American?
Yes, Murray. So some of this, I think we also play out in the primaries, the Democratic primaries this year, where younger Black voters were less supportive of Joe Biden. I don't want to, it's all relative, right? So it's easy to overstate that point that I just made. I'm just talking about degrees here and levels of enthusiasm. But there are differences that emerge. I don't, like with what Mark was just saying, I don't know if this is a generational effect among Blacks or if it's just a life cycle effect. I'm not aware of any evidence suggesting that younger African Americans are, I don't know, poised to leave the Democratic Party or somehow moving in the conservative direction to the extent that voters are ideological in the first place. So yes, there are important generational differences that have emerged, or at least that are present in the Black community. But I guess I just call them generational differences. I should say they're important age-related differences, but it's not obvious to me that they're generational differences. That probably remains to be seen.
What about in general? Amy, do you have any thoughts? Just general differences in generation, age?
Oh, on age generation. You know, I do think clearly the group under 45 years old was the most pro-Biden of the age groups. And so, you know, to me, the fascinating piece of all of this is going to be where these millennials and Zers end up 20 years from now. The other thing that I think has to be said too is, you know, part of our challenge in this moment that we're living through is the information flow and how people are getting their information. It is more diffused than ever. It is allowing us to be more isolated than ever in these bubbles. We've known this for some time, but I think it's gotten so much worse. Even over the last few years. And my hope is that it is this upcoming generation, a generation that's known nothing but being online, has only known of a world where there are multiple sources of information. They don't think like us old fogies and tell stories about when I was your age, everybody watched one of 3 channels and I had to use a dial. I had to turn it on, right? I still have to tell my kid constantly, if we're at a place that has a television but not DVR, he cannot understand why there are commercials and why you can't watch exactly what you want to watch, right? So I'm like, this is how TV used to work. You watched things and then they were over and that was it. You were done. So I do sort of feel like we are at this really crucial tipping point here where we're not going to get to the heart of all of these things we've talked about and the challenges around polarization unless we understand and appreciate the challenge of the news and other information getting to people. And we literally have half the country that does not believe anything that's being said by the other half because they literally do not see it in their own world. And that I don't think a politician can solve. Some bipartisan panel can't solve that. This is much more of a societal challenge.
Thanks. What about, we've had a record turnout this year. Do you all think this is sustainable? Is this a one-time thing or is this?
Murray, it's an interesting question. Certainly in previous life, I used to do a lot of work looking at youth civic engagement. And one of the questions that was oftentimes asked is if you were to make it easier for people to vote early, so have more early voting or mail-in voting or same-day election registration, that could have an impact on the number of young people who turn out to vote. It is interesting that this year you do see a lot of policy changes in order to accommodate people's concerns about COVID-19 by allowing either mail-in balloting in a way that wasn't the case before, or absentee balloting that was done differently this year. It does remain to be seen what sort of policy changes might eventually be made at the state level to affect the ways in which people vote. But many states were already moving in many of the directions of what we saw this year with regards to changes around COVID-19. So I don't know. The changes in the way in which people vote may have a long-run impact on the number of people who do turn out to vote, but there are so many other factors that could go into why people turn out to vote. It isn't just about how easy it is or what policies are in place. It depends on the candidates, the issues, the things that are going on in the world that could also have an impact. So there is certainly a unique aspect to 2020.
Also, I'm not a political scientist. I just play one on TV, but I thought that the political science literature tells us that, the best indicator or predictor of voting is previous voting behavior, and that once you start voting and you get in the habit of voting, that makes you a voter, right? And that you will consistently turn out. So we'll get to see if the political science literature is correct here, because I think a whole bunch of new people have been energized over these last 4 years and have become part of this process. Again, it would suggest that it doesn't matter about even the age. I'm not even talking about just younger people, but a whole bunch of folks who had been previously, I don't know if they were disillusioned or just didn't feel like it mattered, have now become part of the process.
Yeah, if I could just say quickly, I agree on that point as well. Really on both points that were made by the panelists, that obviously because of COVID-19, we've made it easier in the sense that there's more early voting and more mail-in balloting. But it's also the case that a number of people, for a variety of reasons, thought that the stakes were just higher in this election. So I think the jury is still out, to perhaps use a bad metaphor, as to why and what contributed to this, what appears to be a record turnout. Was it the COVID-19 and its relationship to the easier access to voting? Was it supporters of Donald Trump or opponents of Donald Trump? I mean, I don't think I know, but I do think, it's worth noting that it is conceivable that one of the factors that contributed to the massive turnout was this concern among many voters that the other side represented an existential threat. Now, that may turn out not to be a factor, but at least preliminarily, it seems to me that was probably one factor. And to the extent that's true, we'll see how that plays out, not just in this Georgia runoff election, perhaps in January, but also, with the midterms. It's, we just concluded one election, so now we're talking about the midterms, but that's the nature of this process. So in 2022, let's see, Donald Trump's not going to be on the ballot. So if we still get massive turnout, then I guess it wasn't Donald Trump.
That's good answer. I've been getting a lot of questions, methodology questions, and let me just answer a slew of them. One is about the shy Trump voter that didn't want to be interviewed. Another is the defiant Trump supporter that didn't want to participate because they're defiant. The question about lying to pollsters, social desirability of answering, and questions of waiting and stuff like that. And pretty much for the most part, those are going to be answered probably over the next month or two. There's not a lot of evidence of shy Trump voters, but I think there's going to be a pretty exhaustive study of what we can to answer these. If any of you want to comment, go ahead. But there've been a lot of questions about methodology. If any of you have any great answer, and I will look for the next question.
Well, I'll just say while you're looking that I agree with your basic summary there, Marie. I think obviously we're all craving answers for why there were discrepancies with the polls, and it would be nice if we could, or I won't speak for the other panelists, but I'll just speak for myself. It would be nice if I could provide those answers, but I'm afraid I cannot do that. So not because I know it and I'm withholding it, but because I don't know what the answer is.
Yep. Anyone else? Yeah, there's been quite one question about the education adjustment that was done in 2016. I would think that would have helped, but I would bet on it. But we'll know a lot of these things going further. What surprised you? Is there anything that surprised you about this election and the results going in, and what? Yeah.
I mean, the stability, as we discussed, is the surprising piece. Again, if you were born this year and you go to put your PhD dissertation together about the election of 2020, and you say, "Oh my gosh, look at all these crazy things that happened that year." I mean, it must have been a crazy election because of all this, the pandemic and economy and race, right? How are you going to explain that? So that is truly surprising. But to me, the Susan Collins race was one of the bigger surprises. It was one of those where you have we've been seeing over the last, again, it's not just a Trump phenomenon, but over the last 10, 15 years, the real death of ticket splitting. And we're even seeing it, I mean, I feel it in my own community that, people aren't even at the city council level or at the county level allowed to vote for a candidate that doesn't sort of line up with their national partisan identity or how they would vote for a federal candidate. And so when you go to a place like Maine, and it is very parochial, it's also a state that literally is divided in half. The southern half of the state, especially along the coast, is much more liberal, democratic than the northern part of the state, which is more rural. Of course, in the old days, it was opposite, right? It was Rockefeller Republicans down around Portland, and it was Labor Democrats up in the northern part of the state. But, it just seemed as if, given all of the historical challenges in front of Susan Collins about, partisanship and the top of the ticket, even though she has deep roots there, even though she has in the past overcome big Democratic margins, that this was going to be the year where it just ran out. And not only did she win, but it was by a significant margin. And, you know, this is another place where folks saying, what did the polls get wrong? There's going to be a lot of digging into the data there. But I think, to me, there was something sort of heartening about that, that we can finally have a break for in this pattern of just voters straight ticket voting. And also in that state, a Democrat in that northern congressional district won re-election pretty easily, despite the fact that Donald Trump won there. So good on you, Maine, keeping up the ticket splitting tradition, keeping up the independent streak. But unfortunately, it's the only one out there.
Yeah, very quickly, I'll just say I also found the Susan Collins contest, in part because I don't think any of the pre-election polls had her winning, or at least had her ahead.
Yeah.
So that surprised me. I was surprised by Georgia. And yes, the polls were saying that it was close, could go either way. I completely discounted those polls. So, you know, there's nothing scientific in my approach to polls, I suppose. I thought because no Democrat had won there in 30 years, that this Democrat wasn't going to be any different. But that wasn't the case. And then finally, although I already said it, I'll just quickly answer again that I thought that the Democrats were going to make more headway among whites as a group writ large. Because again, not because I thought that they would be moving as a group away from the Republican Party, but because Trump, I thought, would be perceived for a variety of reasons, which objectively one could point to, as a failed president. And I expected the Democrats to make more headway among that population, but that turned out not to be the case.
And Mary, I would add something that, well, I wouldn't say it was surprising. I found it very interesting in a pre-election story, how attention to Latino voters was different this year than it's been in the past. There was an emerging realization of the differences within the Hispanic population, and many reporters were asking questions of me that were different and much more nuanced and varied than they had been in previous elections. And so while there has been some conversation about, well, why would Latino voters we've seen an increase in support among Latino voters for Trump relative to 2016, it was notable to me how time had shifted some to talk about the various components of the Latino population and how different and nuanced it is across the country. Again, this wasn't something that was true in previous elections that I've been where I've been following the Latino vote, and that to me was somewhat striking this year.
So I'm going to read this from Holly Reed. I just thought it was kind of cute, and it's a question too. I would agree with Dr. Hutchings that this deep partisan or racist divide is very troubling. It is also extremely troubling that we spend so much money on elections if it has so little to no impact on outcomes. I wonder if the panelists see any possibility of campaign finance reform going forward.
Well, a lot of that depends on what happens in Georgia in the next month or two. I think that, yeah, there's a debate this is not a literature I've contributed to, but I've at least consumed some of it. There's been a debate for some time in political science about whether basically campaigns matter. I'm not going to argue that they don't matter. In part, the apparent limited impact of campaigns is because there's a canceling out effect going on. So if one side were simply to say, screw this, the political science literature says campaigns don't matter, let's save that money, it would probably hurt them considerably. So but having said that, given the expectation that both sides are going to contribute considerable resources to this effort, the net effect is likely to be small, and therefore kind of priors like partisanship tend to play an outsized role. And then I'll just say quickly, do I think there's a possibility? Well, I guess I've already answered that part. I mean, it's going to be a tough, even if the Democrats somehow manage to win the 2 Senate seats in Georgia, and therefore with Kamala Harris, get someone other than Mitch McConnell as the majority leader, I guess Chuck Schumer, this would still be a heavy lift. I mean, so I think the short answer is it's going to be difficult.
That'd be my answer too. Given how much this election looks to have followed party simple fundamentals, as you've all pointed out, despite the wild year we've had, is there reason to think that policy stances from either candidate had an impact on shaping votes?
I mean, Amy actually spoke to this earlier, so maybe she can elaborate. But I actually agreed with her earlier comment, which is that it may well have played a role, but it was probably minimal. Political science literature, again, I'm like a broken record, but at the end of the day, that's all I basically have to draw on is my training. And so the political science literature suggests that policies and policy preferences do matter and they can make a difference, but these loyalties on the basis of race or class or gender or religion or whatever are typically far more consequential. So I wouldn't say that it didn't make a difference, particularly in the year with a pandemic, but it's clear, at least as I see the preliminary exit poll data, that the issues apparently weren't that important in terms of how people voted. If I knew nothing about the issues and only knew their partisanship and their social demographic backgrounds, that would probably be sufficient for me to understand this election.
That's a good quote. Here's a big one. If partisanship is the main driver, how do we get people to look for good information instead of staying in their information bubbles? Since that seems to be an important part for deliberation and democracy.
Well, what I have found interesting over these last few years, and again, this didn't start with Donald Trump, but it certainly has been accelerated under his 4 years in office, is that we have a density divide more than anything else. And the more dense one's community, in other words, like people per square mile, the more likely that you will identify with the Democratic Party, whether you register as a Democrat or not, and if you live in places that have fewer people, or it's not as the population density is not as big, you're more likely to vote Republican. I mean, Pew has been covering this for quite some time. And so that gets also to this question, or this issue we keep talking about, which is this existential question about who America is and what America is and what it means to be an American. And what to be an American mean? I should be able to get in my car, drive anywhere I want, do whatever, build my house wherever I want, put whatever on my property, versus, oh, I want to live in a community where we're all looking out for each other and we're, we have shared space. And even though we come from different places, we have these sort of core shared values, and I want to learn from other people and I want to be in constant contact with all kinds of different people. That's also shaping our views too of how we vote. And again, the people who are representing those people are coming from one party. And so the Republican Party has now become the party of rural and small town America, and the Democratic Party is the party of urban and suburban America. And that's impacting our politics, right? Because there was a time not that long ago. In fact, I was just going back and looking at what the Senate, like in 2009, Joe Biden and Barack Obama, wasn't a lot. Senators from North Dakota. They had a Louisiana Democrats. You had Nebraska Democrat, right? That's not going to happen. You're not going to have Republicans. Just the year before, they had lost in Rhode Island and in Oregon. And so, like, that is a piece of it too. We have the two parties that represent these density issues, right? Or the density divide. And as long as you live in one of those regions, it's going to be more likely that you identify with that party because you're going to be represented by that party.
Do you think the polls affected how people voted?
I don't know. I mean, I do think there is something to, you know, what people are consuming and their opinions about it. But again, I also think there is an entire group of people that believe that the polls were wrong all along, right? And that they were fake news polls. And so they were going to go vote regardless. You know, there's some, well, there's a damping, right? And I can appreciate that in years past where your supporters would hear all the news about how you're losing in the polls or how your party's going to get crushed. And so you decided, I'm not going to show up. It doesn't really matter. Maybe I'll vote third party. It doesn't matter because my party's going to lose. In this case, I think the folks who were most attuned to the polls and most surprised by the polls were the people who wanted them most to be correct and wanted Joe Biden to win by a big margin. And so I think what we saw were really the surge on both sides, driven one by hoping the polls were right and worried that they weren't, and the other not paying any attention because they believed that the polls were wrong in 2016 and they're still wrong now.
Whoops. I think we lost Amy for a second. So to all of you, we have a few minutes left. If you, there's a question that you want to ask that you may have asked that I missed it or whatever, go ahead and do it. But keep it like a question, not two paragraphs. It's hard to get through all that. I have one question, and while we're waiting, and then we'll end if we don't get any more. What about the runoff coming? Is there any, do you have any thoughts about it? We've just had an election. Any thoughts about the runoff in terms of what we've seen in the election, or just general thoughts?
I had a quick thought. One, I looked at those in part because of another election panel I was on, and I was surprised that the combined Republican vote in both of the two Senate contests didn't exceed 50%. Now it was marginally greater than the combined Democratic vote, but the difference was about 2 percentage points or less. And I mean, that surprises me. I would have thought that, I get that there were multiple candidates running for these seats. And so not surprisingly, no one got over 50%, especially for the Loeffler seat, if I can call it that. But I still would have expected there to be, basically there was more than 50% Republican support, and they just split the vote because they had too many candidates. But that does not appear to be the case. Now, does that mean that the Democrats are going to win in January? Well, I won't go that far. But the point that I just made, coupled with the fact that Joe Biden has apparently won that state, although there is obviously a recount, suggests to me that Democrats have a better shot than I would have said if you had presented this scenario to me 6 months ago, or 6 weeks ago, or 6 days ago.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, look, we're going to get our first chance to see what a contest looks like without Donald Trump on the ballot and without Donald Trump in the White House. Now, he'll still officially be in the White House. It's January 5th. But, the question, I assumed that he would be, meaning Donald Trump, would be doing rallies at this moment in Georgia for those candidates, or that, once we get to December, he won't be able to help himself but go down and do rallies. Now, there's reporting that suggests that he might not be that into it, since it's not for him. It's really just for some other candidate. He's not quite as interested in doing that. But that would certainly be helpful to have him come down there and turn out the base, as he obviously proved he could do. Wasn't enough to win, but got record turnout there. Democrats look at a runoff in Georgia and all they see is what happened in 2008 when Barack Obama won pretty handily, and yet the runoff that year in Georgia, the Republican won very handily. And obviously the state has changed a great deal since 2008, and where the vote is coming from has changed a great deal since 2008. But the messaging isn't going to look much different. And Kelly Loeffler, the appointed senator, just put up an ad against her opponent, Raphael Warnock, who's the pastor at the Ebenezer AME Church in Atlanta. And surprise, surprise, the tagline is, wait, how does it go? The tagline is something about save the Senate, save America. And then it spends a good amount of time talking about Reverend Warnock's praise for Jeremiah Wright. We all remember him from 2008, Barack Obama's then pastor, and making not so veiled appeals on race. And so getting back to where we really began all of this, which is the question to me is then, one, what does African-American turnout look there? And two, the white vote for Biden was 29%. Can the Democratic candidates hit, or even they'll probably have to exceed that a little bit in order to win the state? But it's clear that Republicans understand and appreciate that too.
Well, I have one comment about Georgia. I wish I would like to own some shares in a media company in Georgia, because there is going to be so much money going there in the next couple months.
Well, you can do it now, Murray. It's going to be a battleground state. Go buy a station in Savannah or something, and then you have to go visit it. It'd be great. That's what I want to do. I want to go somewhere like, forget Atlanta. Like, we always have to go to Atlanta. I want to go like to a small market.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, and a really small market too. One where, could be a little more affordable, and it's kind of a nice getaway. That's what I'm going to do.
Columbus.
Okay.
Columbus, exactly. Athens. Got a lot to do.
Cool. Let's see if there's, we've got some thank yous. In the ongoing argument about whether parties should focus on turnout or on persuasion, does this election offer any evidence one way or the other?
Absolutely. Donald Trump thought he could win just purely on turnout.
Right.
And it didn't work. You still have to win a middle. And I know the middle is not interesting and it's not fun and it's this much of the population, but that's how you win an election.
Great, thank you. Last one, I think. There's a question about disinformation. We had a really great panel yesterday, Wednesday on it. But I was just wondering if any of you have any thoughts or anything that you've noticed in this campaign about the effect of it.
Well, I've seen some of it play out. I'm in Michigan, so there was a lot of misinformation about the vote counting process in Detroit. Some of this also played out, from what I understand, in Philadelphia. This is more about the aftermath of the election, however, than the run-up to the election. But yeah, misinformation, I don't know how big a causal role misinformation plays. It may be that people embrace misinformation because they're inclined to embrace it more so than they are just misled, I suspect. But but it certainly seems to be playing out in the aftermath. And of course, it has implications for one thing we haven't talked about in this extremely exciting and interesting panel discussion is the fact that the sitting president of the United States has lost and has refused to concede, and indeed has refused to admit that he lost. So we're going to talk about misinformation. How about misinformation with respect to the fact that, a counting of the votes is unfolded that clearly indicates that one candidate won and one candidate did not. And there are respected political figures up to and including the current president of the United States who completely have disavowed that information.
I wonder if that's our time to end.
Why not?
Why not? Okay.
It's Friday. No, everybody needs
Yeah.
a cocktail. I know I do.
So
Ben.
thank you all very much. I think it's been great. I thank you for a great session. And to those of you that have asked a lot of methodological questions, I encourage you to look for what will probably be our next event. And there will be more others besides ours, but keep your eye out for ours. If you're new to polling, I highly recommend you check out the Roper Center at Cornell University. We have a feature called iPoll where you can access just about anything in polling. It's just really wonderful. And we have a really large archive. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful year.
Thank you, Murray.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.